Good afternoon and welcome to CRS 333, Curriculum Studies in History, in week 2, where we're going to begin by looking at the assessment item in developing a lesson plan sequence. And this is worth 1,500 words or 30%, and it's due in week 6. Now notice the word count of 1,000 words for the lesson plan itself. And if there's 4 lessons of 250 words, you've only got 250 words for each of the lesson plans. And then there's a justification of 500 words. And a number of the resources in the literature suggest that the justification is equally important. That is, it's the reasons why you're doing certain things are just as important as the content and the information and the knowledge. One of the ways in which you can handle the challenge that's placed here of the limited number of words of 1,500 words is that you can have an appendix. And even though the appendix doesn't count in terms of being marked, it gives you somewhere to store and display the material that you might be developing for your own lessons in the future. After all, one of the major reasons why we're studying and developing resources is that we might be equipped in the future for the teaching that we're doing. And 1,500 words may not fully equip you in the future for what you want to do. And so the appendix is one place that you can put this information. And if you have a PowerPoint or some resource, you could place that information in the appendix. And another strategy I've seen some students use at times is they might have another place where they've put a resource online and they might have a website link to that other place. And I've seen that on a number of occasions as well. So in this 1,500 word lesson plans and justification, firstly, we need to think about the sequence of the lessons. So you'll have one lesson will be an introduction, and then you'll have 2 lessons as examples of lessons that you would be teaching in the topic that you've chosen in year 11 and 12 history. And then you'll also have a concluding lesson where you draw it together, and this will be a chance to exercise your skills as a teacher in drawing together and evaluating what has been learned and ensuring students have got what they need to go forward and apply the information in areas of their lives. So you're asked to use Understanding by Design and other resources to create these lessons. And you're asked to connect them to the general capabilities and also to carefully consider appropriate age differentiation and ability differentiation. And you'll often find in classes today that you may be required to not only teach a group of students who have a certain level of abilities, there may be 2 or 3 or more who have more advanced abilities, and there can be some students who are being included in the classroom who could even be a few years behind in terms of their capabilities. And you've got to have a way of providing resources for them and working with them so that they feel included, even though they're not necessarily at the same academic level as the other students in your class. So some of this discussion can be included in the justification, and all of these ideas need to be shown in the lesson plan that you develop. So let's take a few moments to think about what's included in the goals that you have for your lessons. Firstly, there'll be the knowledge element, and this will often be in time sequence, and so you'll choose your area of interest, which might be the French Revolution, and so there'll be events before, during, and after. And so you place these in time sequence, and this could be 3, 4, 5 or more lessons. And then you need to consider the relevance of this knowledge to the students. And you could even ask during the lessons, how do you see this as relevant to your lives as students? Some will see these events as relevance to an understanding of leadership or the way society functions. Others might see these events as helpful for understanding social relationships. Others might see it as helpful for understanding values and ethics. And for Christian students and students from other traditions, they may see it as relating to spiritual values or other values such as those. One of the major things that we try to teach in history is the skills in analysis, interpretation, identifying bias, locating original primary resources that can take us back to the writing and the thoughts of the original time and setting and people. Original resources, primary resources, are so vitally important because it's only as you read those you get a feel for and an understanding of the original time and setting. I know in the work that I have done on science and religion, there is often a statement that science is taking over and religion is fading, and this is called the secularization thesis. However, when you go back and read the original writings of scientists, you discover there is no secularization thesis. So, reading the secondary resources and the other resources that are out there leads you to a different viewpoint than what you gain if you go back to the original writings. Similarly, there are those who write on the warfare between science and religion, and if you go back to the original sources, you find that there is no warfare between science and religion. You discover people like Charles Darwin, who writes about evolution, is also a Sunday school teacher, and he's not taking a stand against God. He's rather sharing what he feels science is about as he studies the animal kingdom. And so this warfare idea doesn't align with the primary sources that we read from the time of Darwin, though there are others like Huxtable who do take a more warfare-like approach. But he's another person, not Darwin. Similarly, if you read Isaac Newton, you find that Newton writes about God and Bible. If you read Einstein and science and religion, you find he writes about the value of spirituality and religion. And so reading original resources challenges ideas you find in secondary literature, such as secularization or warfare, and they lead you to very different conclusions. And that's why we value primary sources and why we continually go back to primary sources in seeking to understand the way people thought and wrote in the original contexts and settings when the events took place. It's very hard to understand what happens if we take our modern ideas back centuries past or decades past or even thousands of years past and then impose them on the events that take place in the past. Another area that we're teaching besides skills in analysis, interpretation, synthesis, source evaluation, and research of sources such as primary sources is the understanding of history concepts such as cause and effect. And this gets more complex. That is, what causes an event such as the Russian Revolution? And there are multiple causes, of course, always, but what are some of the primary causes, and how, if we understand those, can we understand what's happening in politics and economics and our world today? There is also notions like continuity and change, and in some ways, events such as science or politics or economics have continuity with the past, but every 5, 10 years, there can be massive changes. And then in some of my scholarly writing, I've written about the changes of the last 50 to 100 years, particularly in relation to religion and science. And we see that every decade there are major changes. And after World War II, with the rise of individualism and the rise of consumerism, They're totally different ways of looking at the world now than 40, 50 years ago, or 100, 200 years ago, or 400 or 500 years ago. And part of the joy of history is going back through time. And if you save up a few pennies and travel, you can travel to Greece and Israel and Egypt and Rome, and you can even get time for a week or a month or 3 months to dig amongst the ruins and find a few archaeological artifacts, and it can give you insights into what is taking place. All of these are opportunities that are available to you. We need to think about historical concepts such as significance, perspective. I should mention, if the students can't travel overseas, as often is the case, you can use virtual reality. And one of the things I love about the study of Pompeii is you can actually do a lot of study of Pompeii by actually going to the sites online. And there's videos of the city of Pompeii and Herculaneum. And you can see people who around 70 AD were buried in ash, and we've still got the bodies of those people in one sense. They pour plaster in, it fills up the space that's there, and you can see very much the city as it was in 70 AD because it was covered with a layer of ash, and it's very much the way it was then. And students, I find this is a very useful place to study. Even if you're here in the classroom, you can do a study of the site, study of the shops, a study of the houses, a study of the paintings on the wall. Students can virtually go there and wander around the streets and see the places where the food was cooked and sold, and go inside the houses from 70 AD and see what Roman life was like in 70 AD. And here's some of the bodies that were excavated. They pour the plaster in, and the skeletons are still there, and the form of the body is still there from 70 AD. And here's a rich man and his slave who were buried in 70 AD at Pompeii, exactly as they were when the ash came from the exploding volcano. And so you can see people exactly as they were at that time, and even whole families, 70 AD, preserved exactly in the position that they were when the volcano exploded. So archaeology provides powerful insights into what things were, and students can be introduced to these archaeological artifacts, and they can experience for themselves the world as it was all these years ago. And of course, you can go online and you can read Plato and ancient Greeks. You can read the ancient Romans and the writings that were written 2,000 years ago or more. And here in Australia, we can go back to cave paintings that take us back thousands and thousands of years in the past. And you can see for our own First Nations people records of the past as well. So we're collecting knowledge, but we're also collecting and developing skills, and we're also developing other valuable aspects of the students' development that are going to be important in your lesson planning. So a good lesson plan should integrate a series of knowledge acquisitions. So there'll be a series of events pre the event, pre the Russian Revolution, French Revolution, during the event, primary sources, and after the event. And then there'll be these concepts that we're talking about, such as the ability to understand analysis and interpretation, the ability to understand cause and effect, continuity and change, significance, and we'll come back to the idea of contestability. That is, how much do we know and how cautious should we be about the claims of knowledge? And I spoke about the example of science and religion. And how much do we know? We can go back and read the writings of the scientists, and that gives us an understanding of what takes place. Besides knowledge and concepts, we have skills, how to locate the sources, how to analyse the sources, and so you can give projects for students to work on and take home homework exercises. Three other areas that we also should consider is ethical understandings. That is, if we collect artefacts from Egypt, put them in a museum in Britain or Australia, what about the loss of the right and ownership to those artefacts to the country where they come from? If we take artefacts from Australia and take them to Britain, what about the First Nations people and the loss of that which they have? So, what's this teach about ethics? And then what's it teach about student ethics and relationship one with another? That is, how should we listen to one another, value one another? As a Christian, one could be interested in the Ten Commandments. And one of the things that I really like, what John Calvin said, is that do not lie really is like the white lines on the edge of the road. If we believe in God, we believe that He is a God of truth. And so one of the ethical standards that we're talking about in the classroom is truth. The road itself, God's gift to the world, is truth. And the white lines saying do not lie are the warning signs on the edge of the road. The white lines saying do not steal. The middle of the road is generosity and kindness and giving. And then that's the character of God. And then the white lines mark the warning about deviating from this. The white line marking do not kill. God's goal and purpose is to give life to humanity. And Jesus said, I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly, that you might flourish. And so it's important when we teach ethics that we place the emphasis on the positive aspects of ethics, such as being life-giving, generous, kind, caring, rather than on the do nots, which are really white lines. And it's important to have do not speed and other things, but the gift of the nation is roads and the opportunity to travel on them. And then there have to be these warning signs, do not go over 70 or 90 or 100 in terms of speeding. So ethical understanding can be an important part of your consideration for your lesson planning, formation, how the student develops as a person. And one of the reasons why we have discussion groups and work with one another is we're developing relational skills and we're developing ethical understanding, such as listening to one another and value one another. These can be an important part of your lesson planning. Intercultural understanding is important, and recognising that some students come from other cultures that speak other languages and have other core values. We in the West often come from an individualistic culture, but other nations might come from a more communal culture, such as Asia. And when we're talking to one another as students and teachers, we have to recognise that there can be these different perspectives because people come from different cultures. Also, in our lesson planning, we need to consider personal and social capabilities and relational capabilities. We need to consider cross-curriculum notions such as literature, how do students write and practice their writing in history, but also how do they practice other skills, which could include appreciation of the visual arts or appreciation of drama and sport. If you do the Roman Games, then appreciation of these areas. And if you do the Roman Games, you could actually consider other areas involved there in the games. In progress. In order to answer a question that a student might ask, how do you include a comparative study in your lesson plan? We could consider the Roman Games. Firstly, Let's remember that a comparative study looks at different perspectives that are taken. The challenge is to choose significant perspectives and then to include them. So if you're looking at the Roman games, for example, you could think about, what do students think is meant by games? And we today, when we think of Olympic Games or a sport, may think of competition, or we may think of celebrating skills or the capacities of the human body, or we may think of celebrating the region in which we live. And so it might be one state versus another, or one country versus another. And this, of course, raises a number of ethical questions about them and us. There's a friendly understanding at school between year 8 and 9 and 10 that there is a difference between them and us. But if this turns into too savage a battle in which one elevates themselves above the other, then this becomes ethically very problematic. When we read the Old Testament, there are some Old Testament passages that could suggest Israel is elevated above some of the other nations, but many scholars would suggest that it's not Israel that's elevated, rather that Israel is a smaller nation, Israel's less powerful, Egypt is a bigger nation and more powerful, and that God values the small and the less powerful just as much as he values the more powerful, and sometimes the small and less powerful can find greater opportunities than the more powerful. So it's not elevating Israel to greater than every other nation. It's saying that they are equally valued or as much valued, avoiding the destructive aspects of the them and us that puts the other down. Rather, in listening, one also should consider elevating the one that we're listening to some degree. And Jesus, when he takes the towel and washes the disciples' feet, he's placing an emphasis on humility. And you'll find through the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's an emphasis on relationship, whereby if we're going to relate to others, we need to be humble, we need to be listening. And particularly as we come before God, we would need to be humble and listening. As we come before one another, we need to be humble and listening. But this needs to be balanced with not being a doormat and walked over. That is, we need to recognize that we are also highly valued. And that's the emphasis we see in the Old Testament on Israel. It's highly valued nation, highly valued people. But in a way that avoids the them and us dichotomy that elevates one above the other. So be careful, as is shown in the Roman and Greek games, of dangers of elevating one above the other, and recognise that sport and games can be celebrating something rather different. That is celebrating the capacities of the human body and the capacities of a team and the capacities to put together abilities. There are scholarly articles. If you go to Google Scholar and you're interested in comparison, such as in the Roman or Greek games, you could type in Roman Games Ancient Comparison, and it would bring up a number of scholarly articles on Roman versus Greek culture and games and the ways they viewed them, or Roman ancient games versus modern views of games, or games in comparison to war. So I do find that Google Scholar, that is https scholar.google.com, will give you some excellent resources that will also give you the capacity to read these resources and work with those resources, and you'll be able to get some really good insights from these resources that you can apply. So if we were to put Google Scholar into our search engine, and then if we were to take Roman games and comparison and put that into our search engine, then we would find some resources that you could use. And as I said before, once you start doing this sort of thing, you soon end up with way more than 500 words justification or 250 words for a lesson plan. And as I've suggested for your own resource, you could have an appendix or you can have a folder that you keep in which you put some of these resources. So notice here the first one that comes up under Roman games, ancient comparison, is a comparison between Greek and Roman games. If we click on cite, we can colour in Control C, make a copy of that reference, and then we can go to that reference there, and we can read that, and then we can make some notes on that, and you've got a huge number of resources that you can use there, and it's not long before you got thousands. Sometimes I end up planning a lesson and I've got 10,000 words that I've put together, which obviously I can't hand into my teacher or necessarily to every student, but I enjoy reading it, as many others do. That's why we become scholars, because we enjoy reading all of these words. So games, Greek and Roman, you can read through here, you can take some notes, and then you can rewrite material in your own words. You can put this to one aside and write freely your summary of what you've read, and then you can cite this. Notice we call this a scholarly article because at the end we have a good number of scholarly references. These are used throughout the article, and it's been published in a scholarly document, and it's been peer reviewed, and many of these resources have been peer reviewed. This one's been published in the Encyclopedia of Ancient History 2013 and been peer reviewed, and that's why they're scholarly articles, and that's why they're in Google Scholar. So I encourage you in your writing to work as much as you can with scholarly articles such as you find in Google Scholar. So a scholarly article is one in which we can identify the author, and we could go to the university where they're a professor with a PhD, who've spent not only their bachelor and master's studies, 3-year bachelor or 4-year bachelor with honours, and 2 years master's, but then they've gone on to do an additional 3 or 4 years on top, so they're up to 6, 8 or 10 years of study in that area that's highly recognised, and then they've completed their PhD study, such as I have done. And you can see that there's lots of articles there on various comparisons between one culture and another in ancient times, between ancient and modern viewpoints, between one way of viewing games, such as a nice light-hearted thing, or the Romans would see it as aligning with developing skills that you would use in war. So for some, games and sport are more about the individual. For others, they're more about tribal cooperation. And even today, we have individualistic sports and we have team sports. And in rugby, which is the name of a school in England, and so at this Christian school in rugby, they came up with certain rules which was intertwined with the values of Christian educators, particularly Thomas Arnold, who was the headmaster of rugby school. And so he came up with these teamwork processes. So this is a little historical study in order to develop character and teamwork and Christian morality in students. The concept further developed as the idea of muscular Christianity, that is, God gives us muscles and Jesus and God can help us to use physical fitness and moral strength in the development of the human person. It's interesting that this development is partly around the headmaster of rugby, Thomas Arnold, and this leads to the great man theory of history, suggesting that it's great men who come up with ideas in history, and Thomas Carlyle promotes this great man theory, and some leadership material today also talks about great man theory, and some politics talks about great man theory. Others would say it's not so much great men, but it's whole teams of people. It's not Walt Disney, but it's the whole Disney team that produces what he produces. And it's not Steve Jobs with Apple, it's the whole team that produce Apple, iPhones, and other products. So, great man theory is an interesting concept in history. Thomas Arnold may have been significant influence, but others were also involved. The idea of muscular Christianity. And then there are feminists who write about, with concern, that if we promote a certain view of gender, then we may exclude women. And how do we work with gender difference? And so this is another difference in perspective, the difference between men and women. And you could do a comparison between male and female, which could be called a feminist critique of approaches. And many scholars who go on to masters and PhD and university study will look at feminist critique. It's very much a big concern of the last 100 years. Environment's another big concern. For some, the games are about individual, for some about tribal competition, and for some, like Thomas Arnold, they're about developing values and character and Christian values. And this raises the question, why do we celebrate celebrities who play sport? And what other comparisons do we make? It's worth thinking about. So history overflows with sociology, politics, and national and religious concepts that can be considered. And we could think about the meaning of the games back then, the meaning of the games for Rome and Greece, and the meaning of the games for us today, and the meaning of the games for us today compared to 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and 200 years ago. Games and sport tend to change in meaning over time. We might compare a range of ideologies. We might compare back in Roman times, the gladiators, says Kyle in his book on the spectacles of death in ancient Rome, when the emperor could hold his hand up or not. And there's whole questions about that you could explore. Kyle argues that gladiators symbolised Romans' dominion through military might, perhaps, or through physical prowess over life and death. And chariot races and factions also mirrored other social ideas, such as social division and communal identity in ancient times. Games in the theatre, where there could be wrestling and gladiatorial fights, and even filling the theatre base or the Colosseum with water so that battleships could fight one another. These serve as places of moral instruction and political allegory and teaching from the Roman thinkers and leaders of the time through to the plebiscite of the time. So similarly in Greece, festivals like Dionysia, or in Roman games, often they're about politics and military. It's interesting, Henry VIII at one stage was going to ban soccer in England because he felt everyone should be doing archery and other sports that would prepare people to fight against the French and defend the nation. And so different views of games are fascinating. For some, games reinforce social hierarchy, and only certain in the upper hierarchy are able to play certain games. And even today, questions must be asked in Formula One racing or other areas. Does it separate the wealthy from the less wealthy? So there's a lot of examples here in the discussion of the Roman games on comparative study. Basically, in comparative study, we're discussing different perspectives on areas within the topic that you are looking at, and we're looking at the most significant perspectives. And for some, it would be male versus female. For some, it would be ethical cooperation versus individualism. So in each of these areas that you are looking at, You will need to also consider um, differentiation. That is, how do you work with different abilities and readiness? And one will often find in a classroom of 20, 30 that a third of the class may be very able and gallop ahead, quickly grasp the knowledge, and another third of the class may take a bit longer and you've got to work with them, and peer to peer may help them develop their abilities, and then another third of the class are going to struggle, or their interest is elsewhere, or they've not slept all night, or things are going on at home. And we have to be careful not to take a negative attitude towards those who are struggling with the ability, but to work with them where they're at. Take note that in these lesson plans, you need to consider the general capabilities, of which the most obvious is a knowledge of the events before what takes place, such as the revolution, during what takes place, and then after what takes place. But the capabilities also include skills in historical analysis, gathering information, and connecting with English and literature, the skill in writing up and communicating and speaking about what they have learnt, attitudes and values, and behaviours, and understanding the behaviour of another and entering into empathetically with an understanding of another person's behaviour. And it's useful around your table and around the classroom to divide groups up and to have some groups experiencing what it means to be part of the lower class who are oppressed and put down, and then to be experiencing what it means to be the upper class and those who are elevated, and to think about how should the upper class feel about the lower class and the excluded. And the same can be done with societies in our world today. There are groups of people that are excluded for various reasons, and you could put on blindfolds and we could experience being blind, and you could block ears and experience being deaf, and give empathy for the different experiences that students are facing. So some of the general capabilities include literacy, ability to write and speak and communicate; numeracy, the ability to understand statistics. And statistics is fascinating. I've taught that for a few years. Digital literacy is increasingly important. That is, how do we understand all of the internet resources and select from what's there? How do we even prepare resources? And you might have a lesson that involves the students preparing a resource that they could present in a digital manner. Um, Creative thinking, where students are able to think outside the box creatively. And I've had students who've writing an essay and then said, can they use Egyptian cuneiform in the writing of the essay? And I'm a bit out there at times, and I encourage it. I get them to write part of it, providing they can understand what the symbols mean, and to write in English that I can understand what they're saying using the Egyptian cuneiform. And that was fascinating, and they got a high distinction for that. And then they have gone on to do some very valuable things. I had one student that I taught once who's gone on and got quite inspired, and he now does work with Space Agency and NASA and things. It's amazing where students can go. Ethical understanding is highly important, as we've mentioned before. How do we encourage understanding of other viewpoints, and then others in the classroom and their viewpoint, and those who would normally be overlooked or looked down upon? Intercultural understanding, similarly, how do we understand different cultures and viewpoints from different cultures? So all of these general capabilities are going to be foundational to what you do. And this is why I've said on occasion, the justification for what you do, the reasons for what you do, these underlining goals need to be thought about. Otherwise, the lesson will fail if it's only just some content and we don't know or understand the reasons for doing the content. So in modern history, literacy will be important, writing and speaking and developing arguments and analysing written sources. And this brings in the whole question of storytelling. That is, just because someone can tell the story well, does it mean that it's truth telling? Um, Critical and creative thinking and writing can be important, and it certainly is important. Let's take as an example the French Revolution, the shaping of the modern world. We've got the knowledge of the facts before, during, and after the events, and some key people. And this then raises the question of great men, great man theory, such as Mr. Guillotine for developing the guillotine. We could speak about that for a while, couldn't we? And then there's concept development, and the revolution, its causes, its effect, its significance, continuity with the past, such as royalty, and ways of understanding tradition and authority, and then change as we move towards democracy. And to what extent does the French Revolution move towards democracy and move towards the left and the right? It's worth thinking a bit about the left and the right. My understanding is that the right stays with tradition, whereas the left is more reforming. And so in the French Parliament, they would sit on the left and the right. And then how do we apply that today? That is, when you're speaking to someone, to what extent do we value things as they've always been? Which is a more tradition-based way of looking at things, and to what extent do we want reform and change, and how do we develop democracy in the classroom today? One viewpoint is each person gets to speak once for up to 2 minutes. You might even pass a little baton around as they speak, and then having had your opportunity to speak, you're not then allowed to speak again until everyone else in the room has had the opportunity to speak. So these ideas of democracy, whether they be on small scale in the classroom or within the town, or whether they be on a larger scale, or whether they be down in Canberra in Parliament, all flow out of a discussion which goes back to events like the French Revolution, the Magna Carta, the development of Parliament through 1,000 years of history. Skills development is highly important, and you could have a section in your lesson development on skills such as locating sources, analysis of sources, looking at different perspectives, developing and constructing arguments, understanding and interpreting arguments and their validity, ethical understanding and values, justice and power, and human rights are also vitally important. And then for Christians, there are Christian perspectives on values, such as we mentioned in relation to the Ten Commandments and to Jesus' teaching on love, and to Paul's writings in the New Testament. Intercultural understandings, recognizing perspectives from different nations, hence in the Roman games versus the Greek view of games. Personal and social capabilities include the encouragement of collaboration, critical reflection, respectful dialogue, which can take place. So if you were to develop some lessons, let me give you a brief example. Your first lesson, and often you would use the lesson planning outline of your university, and if you're with Alpha Crucis, there are lesson plans that you can use from Alpha Crucis. And firstly, prelude to the French Revolution, setting the scene, activity. You could display a political cartoon of the three estates, and you could then discuss the three estates and what they mean. And you could then think about cartooning. You'd even get students to look at the three estates the in their own world. So the first estate and the second estate are the nobility. And so back in Jesus' time, The nobility could have been the kings like Herod, and the clergy could have been the religious rulers of the times, the scribes and Pharisees, and then the third estate are the common people, such as the fishermen. Interestingly, Jesus spends time with the commoners and the fishermen, and then he overturns the tables in the temple run by the clergy, and then he goes on trial before the nobility, and through the death and resurrection of Jesus and the continual growth of Christianity. So the clergy haven't survived. The nobility haven't necessarily survived, but Christianity is now one of the largest movements in the world in which people are finding a sense of purpose and meaning in life. And so sometimes the commoners win, such as we find in this discussion of the three estates. But you've got these cartoons, and here is the cartoon of the three estates, and it looks like one view is that the military might carry the religious, and they in turn carry the working person. But in this model, you've got the working person doing all the work, gathering the food, doing everything, and the religious are riding on the back, and the mighty kings and queens are walking behind. And you could do a lot of discussion on that cartoon, but we digress. So that's one example. And you could write your first impressions. What's the artist saying? And then I would be thinking about, how does it apply today? What are the leading powers today? And some would say it's economics. And businessmen. And so it's the Elon Musks who are the real hard workers. And then others would say, no, it's the ordinary everyday worker who's putting in the time. And feminists would say it's the women who are doing all of the work. So there's lots of ways that you could develop this lesson plan there in interesting ways. You could develop a little lecture, and it could go for 10 minutes or 20 minutes. And I tend to often have these little lectures and put up slides. And you could discuss monarchy, reign of a king. You could discuss the estates, reign through ownership of land. You could discuss the Enlightenment, in which there's a move away from the belief that the light of God's knowledge and revelation comes through the church in Rome and through the bishops who are learned, and they've done a lot of study and spent time on their knees before God. And Enlightenment says every individual can have the light of God in their own life, and the light of God can be revealed through observing the natural world. And so if you go and, like a scientist, and observe what's in the natural world and say this is what occurs, and if there's a king or a clergy who says no, we think this is what occurs, then Enlightenment would say, no, it's the light of everyone's revelation and knowledge of what's going on needs to be considered, and democracy flows out of this Enlightenment concept. And again, you only really understand the Enlightenment by going back and reading the primary sources of the people in the midst of the Enlightenment and what they wrote, and recognize there's huge differences between viewpoints and between viewpoints in different countries on what this light within everyone's life would mean. And thus you could explain the terms for 10 or 20 minutes. You could then have the students work in pair share, where they talk to one another, two people, and then you could get into larger groups. 4 students talk about what is meant by these terms and their application today, and whether one group deserves more say in the world. Do the learned people from the universities need to have more say than the carpenters and electricians in our society today? So there's lots of questions that arise from this. You could do concept mapping for 10 or 20 minutes. You could do primary source analysis, where you could provide, as a teacher, excerpts from Voltaire and Rousseau. And this could bring ethical understanding as well as skills. Notice on the right-hand side, the focus areas are mentioned. And then you could have up to an hour where you could reflect and the students could share, stand up the front, share, or you could break into groups. And if there's room out in the hall or different places, you could break into different groups and different presentations if that worked well. Or you go to the library and spend some time gathering resources, working with them, and preparing a display. Lesson 2, the key event, the storming of the Bastille. And so you could recount the events and the significance of Bastille's fall. You could analyse perspectives. These are the learning goals. And then you would have the times and the activities and the focus areas. You could look at paintings of the time of the storming of Bastille. You could rotate through different stations around the classroom and look at news reports and engravings and give students a feel for what's going on. And then you could have a little clip that might go for 5 minutes that might be a dramatic presentation of what's going on. And then you could have ethical debate, and that can be pair share, where two people debate one with another. I think this, I think that, and then swap over. I think this, I think that. So was it justified? And then lesson 3, the reign of terror. So after the revolution, we then have a interesting reign of terror. And this raises questions as to how is terror and terrorism used by both the lowly in terrorist uprising, or used downward from the top. And so ruling leaders such as kings can use it downwards. And then the 4th lesson we're asking is that you draw a conclusion and you discuss the historical significance as you draw it together, and do seek to draw together all 3 of your previous lessons here, and think about what has changed. Is France the same? Or does France change again and again as it goes forward? We need to bring a sense of closure in which students can apply what they've learned to modern struggles. That is, what's the struggles that the students go through? Remember to consider English as an additional language, so that those students who are not so familiar with Western history or English language are able to gain insights. You need to consider what do the students take home? What have they learned? And how do you evaluate what they've done? So in this class, in week 2, I've just provided a brief overview of some of the areas that we're seeking to cover. I've provided an example, and we want to think about the concepts, the skills, the knowledge, and the values. And then I've reminded you that quite important is these other concepts, such as ethics and understanding and formation and intercultural understanding and differentiation of different abilities, particularly low ability students, how they feel valued and included. And in a separate video, I've put together some material on justification and the importance of justification in the teaching of history, and that you need to give 500 words to justification and reasons why justification works. Now, sometimes in group work, students can work together and discuss why they see it important. Some can then come to a discovery and ownership of what is the reason for valuing what we are talking about. Other times, reading primary sources can bring students to understand understanding the value of what we are talking about. Group work works best when you've got good routines and procedures and students clearly know what to do. You've got well developed, clearly outlined activities, and often a combination of individual and student and teacher directed and class directed, and then you might break into groups for a period of time, and then you might go back to individual work in the last part of the lesson. That pattern often works very well. And so we need to recognise that in justification you could think about the understandings. How is this lesson going to help understand power structures, biases, perspectives? And so by looking at the different challenges that students are facing today, and then looking back at history, we can get insights from the past into the application today. And then, according to scholars such as Wiggins and McTighe, traditional testing often measures recall and knowledge, but not understanding and not values and not motivations. Often justification seeks to encourage ways in which authentic understanding, authentic assessment, authentic teaching considers where the student's at and how they communicate. So encourage you to give some thought to the justification for your lessons from the teacher's perspective, but also from the experience of the student and their perspective as well. I also encourage you to consider the resources that are there each week. And so we have resources on the teacher's role, resources on designing and teaching history lessons. And if you do a wider search on the internet, you'll find a lot of resources on how history lessons can be developed, what can make them exciting. There's a wealth of resources out there, and Google Scholar will give you scholarly analysis of these. Designing and assessing history is another area we've got resources on. And then each week you need to spend 5 to 10 hours and on 5 hours or more on your assignments, and then 5 hours or more on each of these lessons. So there's the introduction, and you'd also go back to the student preparation guide and the other resources and assessments. Make sure you know what's expected, and then send me an email if you have questions. Week 2, we look at the students as learners, and particularly in year 11 and 12. Week 3, we look at the standards that are set, and we also look at Christian standards, and we also look at the New South Wales government standards and the new ones that are coming in 2025, 2027. Week 4, we look at ancient history. Week 5, modern history, and you can also go to the New South Wales guidelines for ancient history, modern history. Make sure you're familiar with what's being covered. We then, week 6, consider assessment, and that's so important to give feedback to you as a teacher, give feedback to the students, give feedback eventually to employers, how students going, and also it brings motivation for gaining greater understanding of what they're studying. And then we look at a course study in week 7, ancient history course study, and then we look further at history topics. And so each week there are resources that I encourage you to become familiar with and to spend some time there. If you have any questions about that, or if any links don't work, as sometimes happens, please get in touch, as the links sometimes, if they're changed somewhere, then we need to change them again. So thank you each one. My name's Dr. Sam Hay, and I have enjoyed working with you in this subject, and I'm very open to working with you further if you have further questions, or further down the line. If you go on to research, I've worked with students who are teaching in schools and students who've gone on to do further studies as well, and happy to work with you in all of those areas as well. So best wishes with this, and let's do keep in touch. Thank you.